Hey fellow nerds. The Mahabharata describes the end of Treta Yuga and the beginning of Dwapar Yuga as an age of confusion. The rivers dried into streamlets, the lakes and the wells lost all their splendors, cities burned down, and people had to abandon where they lived. That's exactly how the mature phase of the Indus Valley ended. You see, Indus Valley can be divided into three distinct phases. The early Harappan phase, which lasted from 3300 BC to 2600 BC. The mature Harappan phase, which lasted from 2600 BC to 1900 BC. And then the late Harappan phase, which lasted from 1900 BC to anywhere from 17 to 1300 BC, depending on what source you ask. In the early phase, there were smaller cities and villages that only started to figure out farming and trade. In the mature phase, there were larger cities. Almost every city like Dholavira, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa come from the mature phase. And in the late phase, the Indus Valley split into multiple smaller civilizations, and civilizations that were parallel to it started rising in power, like the Vedic civilization or its precursor, the ochre pottery culture. In the last video, we ascribed Dwapar Yuga, or the time between Ramayan and Mahabharata, to the late Harappan phase. And as you can see, the transition in between Treta Yuga and Dwapar Yuga is very similar to the transition in between the mature Harappan phase and the late Harappan phase. So when did this happen? It probably happened around 1900 BC, when the Saraswati river dried up, or at least it shrunk in size. And Lord Ram lived around 100 years before the end of Treta Yuga, so that dates him to around 2000 BC. Thank you for watching. Some of you might be angry because I set it too far late into the timeline. I mean, it's supposed to be something like 14,000 BC or something like that, like 16,000 years ago. Or some of you might be angry because I gave it any credence at all. Indian history, you see, disappoints those who try to glorify it and those who try to undermine it equally. Another evidence pointing to the epics and the Purans having some historical validity is how Treta Yuga itself began. It started when Vishnu's sixth avatar, or Parshuram, rose up against the Kshatriyas, or the warrior tribes of the time, and wiped them out 21 times. It was done because the sons of the Emperor Arjuna decided to kill his father. It was a different Arjuna from this one. Arjuna is said to be the emperor of all of India. It was said that in his conquest, he burnt every city on earth. That was probably a hyperbole, but we can find somewhat of a validation for the story when we look at the ruins of the early Harappan period. Most cities on this level have burn marks on them, meaning that they were burnt, giving way for later cities of the mature phase of Indus Valley to pop up. So then, the mature phase began with the burning of the cities and ended with Saraswati drying up and people splitting into multiple factions. Treta Yuga was started by a great burning of many cities and was ended with the river Saraswati drying up and people splitting up into smaller factions. It started an age of confusion which resulted in Dwapar Yuga. And so they align. It goes further. How do you think Satya Yuga began? A great flood happens where Manu is instructed by Matsya, the first avatar of Vishnu, to build a boat and save the people, and save people with some wisdom in them. While there is no archaeological evidence of the Great Flood, every Bronze Age civilization and its successor state has the Great Flood myth, where a person chosen by God guides the people to either top of a mountain or on a boat. So there could have been major floods across the world that gave humans the ability to farm and form civilizations. So Satya Yuga began whenever this great flood happened and ended when there was a great violence enacted on these cities. Satya Yuga must have been prehistory even to the people of Dwapar Yuga and Treta Yuga, as well as the mature and late phase of Indus Valley civilization. Which is why the people ascribed all kinds of metaphorical, legendary stories to this time period, while they tried to keep the history of Dwapar Yuga and Treta Yuga alive. Wait, I thought the Hindu Vedic civilization was something that the Aryans brought in. Why does it tell you the story of the Indus Valley civilization? That's the thing. Remember in my last video about Mahabharata, I talked about the Akar pottery culture, or the culture that is speculated to be a pre-Vedic culture. Well, when you genetically analyze these people, you find that they had no Central Asian or Aryan DNA in them. It was a Vedic civilization and it did not have any Aryan DNA? Turns out the same people that founded the Vedic age of India later down the line were probably the same people who founded the Indus Valley civilization. So there was no Aryan migration? No, there certainly was one. When you do a DNA analysis of Indians, you find out that there was an influx of Central Asian or Aryan DNA from around 3000 years ago to 4000 years ago. When a DNA analysis was done on Indians, it managed to disappoint both the people who propagated the out of India theory and the people who propagated the fact that the Aryans came in and completely replaced the local culture. The fact that there was some Central Asian DNA in Indians thoroughly disproved the fact that the Proto-Indo-Europeans moved out of India. But at the same time, the amount of DNA was low enough that they could not have come in and completely uprooted the local culture and replaced it with their own. So the Aryans did come into India and they likely forced the Indus Valley people to create a mixture or a composite culture that happens to be the modern Indian culture. Maybe they were the ruling class, which is why Kshatriyas from northwestern India have the highest amount of Aryan DNA. Just like the Mughals later in Indian history, they influenced the language far more than they influenced the culture or the genetics of the local people. Like they made the language Hindustani, which is something that majority of Indians speak. It is a umbrella term for Hindi and Urdu, where anywhere from 30 to 50% of words are Persian inspired. But they did not manage to influence the Hindu culture quite as much. Similarly, the Aryans could have influenced the local language, and that's how the familiarity with other Proto-Indo-European languages comes from. And that mixture resulted in Sanskrit. You got any proof of that? Okay, so until now I had been quoting this study, and from now on I'm going to make my own theories by talking about Ramayan. What do you think Lord Ram's greatest achievement was? Well, he killed Ravan and he saved Ma Sita. Sure, that was one of his greatest achievements. But there is another, and there is something greater. Then what was it? Let me set the scene at the beginning of Ramayan. There were 3 groups of people that were there in the lands of India. 1, the Vedic people where Ram is born, and they were the civilized one. 2, the Vanars or the indigenous people of the time. They were usually seen as less than, but they weren't really antagonized by anyone. 3, the Asuras. They were the enemies of the Vedic people. They would trouble and kill and eat the rishis that would go out into the forest to do their penance. What happens in Ramayan is that Lord Ram befriends the Vanars and leads them in a battle against the Asuras, and he defeats them. Once he defeats them, he installs Vibhishan or Ravan's brother at the top of the Asuras, as Vibhishan was the one who stood alongside Ram and betrayed his brother for the sake of Dharma. And through doing this, Ram brings into the fold the Asuras into the mainstream Indian society, as well as by leading the Vanars, he brings them into the mainstream Indian society. Towards the end of the mature Harappan phase, there were three distinctive people groups: the indigenous people of India, the Indus Valley people, and Aryans. And these three people would go on to mix and create the Indian race that we see today. And this mixture would go on all the way until the Gupta Empire 1500 years ago, when caste system would stop the mixing of people. So the greatest achievement of Lord Ram is to make the Indian race. So who was who? Now this study and some speculation does point to the fact that the people of Indus Valley were Vedic people. Well, the Persians have this religion called Zoroastrianism, and their main god is called Ahura Mazda, and their devils or the enemies of good are called Devas. And then there is the Persian tendency of turning Indian S's into H's, like seen in them turning Sindhu into Hindu. That just says that the Indians might have called their god Asura. Now, earlier on, the word Asura was an epithet even used to describe our gods. It meant mighty. But as time went on, by the time Ramayan was written down in 500 BC, it changed its meaning to meaning the devils of our society. That shift probably happened because of the rise of the Persian Empire and their conquest of the western half of the Indic world. But the Persian use of the word Deva to describe their devils far precedes even the finding of Zoroastrianism. And Persians or Iranians were Aryans through and through. That's where Iran, the name of the country, comes from. So the Asuras might have been what the locals called the Aryans, and it was Lord Ram that invited them in to the Vedic society and allowed them to mix. This is some ancient alien level conspiracy. This is not scholarly consensus. The first half of this video might have been, but the second half not really. The Bronze Age and even the Iron Age of India is so clouded with mystery that you can point at any evidence and come up with any narrative. And that narrative would be about as valid as what the experts have come up with. But the fact remains that there is some continuity between the Indus Valley culture and the Vedic culture that came after it. And the fact remains that there is a very small amount of Aryan DNA found within Indians, ranging anywhere from 0% to 17% at the most. You can believe whatever you like, but from what the small amount of evidence that there is, I believe it points to this very narrative. Anyway, my 5-episode long search into finding out what makes an Indian ends with this video. I was not prepared for it to turn into 5 episodes long. I thought it was maybe 2 episodes or 3 episodes, but these 2 episodes snuck up on me and added to the same conversation and answered the questions posed in the first 3 videos. Next time I'll finally break out of this rut and make a video about the time when Buddha achieved his enlightenment, or the Mahajanpad era. See you next time.